Hey there. I'm getting ready for the sermon this Sunday, February 2nd, 2025, and I'm just really pumped about what I'm finding in the text. This week, as we continue to ask the question, who is my neighbor? We're hearing the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, two neighbors whose story Jesus told in Luke 16:19 through 31. In preaching and teaching the Bible, a common image is that of digging for nuggets of wisdom, guidance, or understanding. One of my mentors in ministry talked about how the preacher's task is to go to the text each week, explore and excavate it to the best of his or her ability, and bring what they learn to share with the congregation. I've got to tell you, as someone who has been doing this for 20 years, each week that experience is a bit different. Some weeks the nuggets of wisdom are few and far between. Other times they overwhelm you. Some biblical texts have one or two that leap out at you, while others have a motherlode of insightful words of wisdom and guidance. This week's story that Jesus tells is filled with content that is interesting and important. In fact, there's so much that one sermon cannot cover it all. A good example of that is this book, a collection of sermons by a Christian preacher from the late 4th century, St. John Chrysostom. On the very same story, this incredible preacher offered 6 different sermons to his congregation, all on the same parable. Each of them is incredible and worth reading even 1,600 years later. Now, I'm not going to emulate St. John this week. I'm not going to give you 6 sermons on this story. But as I've prepared, there is more in the parable than I'll be able to cover in Sunday's sermon. There's a couple of things I want you to know before I step into the pulpit this Sunday so that you can hear the story with some foundation. First of all, in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, Jesus is telling a parable. Parables are stories told to share a point of teaching. They are not all-encompassing. When you look at the parables that Jesus told, there are things in them that do not perfectly align with the whole picture of the world and of God that Jesus wants you to know. A good example for me is the parable of the unjust judge who does the right thing, not because he wants to do the right thing, but because he's annoyed by a persistent widow and wants her to stop. Then Jesus says, that's like God. Now, God's not someone who gets annoyed with us and does things to help us just because he wants us to stop. That's just the story that's told to show that we should approach God over and over. In the same way, in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, Jesus speaks of the two men dying and going into the afterlife. The story is told with an eye towards Greco-Roman culture instead of Jewish culture, and the story's description of the afterlife reflects this. Lazarus, we're told, dies and goes to Abraham's bosom, which is an image that draws from Greco-Roman banqueting. And this is relevant because while alive, it was the rich man who enjoyed sumptuous banquets with privileged guests, while Lazarus languished outside, and now the poor Lazarus is the one who enjoys this luxury. Meanwhile, we're told the rich man arrives in Hades. Some translations label this hell, but the Greek is the term Hades, which is an existence beyond death, not based on moral judgment or some sense of salvation from God. Hades is simply the realm of the dead. And while Lazarus is presumably in a portion of Hades where there is feasting and enjoyment, the rich man is in a much less attractive place where he's uncomfortable or even suffering. We know the two men are in the same place in this story because they can see each other, even if they cannot reach each other. And this is important for the story's action. Why talk about this? Because we can think Jesus is describing heaven and hell here, but that's not the point of this parable. And every commentator I read stressed that we need to remember that. In this parable, Jesus isn't focused on what the experience of heaven is like or hell is like. No, Jesus is here focused on what we do in life, how we treat people, especially those who suffer, and how those things matter in the greater scheme of things. So Sunday, when we look at the story of the rich man and Lazarus, I won't be spending a lot of time on the depiction of the afterlife in this story, because that's not really what the story is about, but I wanted you to have the chance to understand that. What's going on here in the world of the story, because that helps us to understand the larger point Jesus is trying to make about how the way we treat our neighbor, especially a neighbor who is poor and hungry, is very important. Thanks for taking the time to listen. If you can be with us in person on Sunday at Farmville Baptist Church, I really look forward to seeing you. But if you can't, we'd love to have you join us live on Zoom or catch the replay afterwards on our YouTube, Facebook, or podcast channels. Have a great day.